The Taliban have announced an amnesty for former Afghan government officials and are calling on women to join their new government. When they were last in power, the ultra-conservative Islamists imposed tight restrictions on daily life and severely limited women's rights. So many Afghans are understandably sceptical and have been trying to flee abroad. But the militants want to convince the country they now control that they have changed.
This is Kabul's new normal, a city full of armed Taliban fighters. Outside the Afghan Interior Ministry, the militants pose for cameras as they stand guard, keen to show who's in charge of the Afghan capital. Their next goal is to convince the Afghan people that there's nothing to be afraid of. We want the people to come to their workplaces or offices. There is no problem on the part of the Islamic Emirate. And the people of the nation should not fear the Mujahideen of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, because the nation is us and we are the nation. And it seems their presence is not so unsettling for everyone in Kabul. Many returned to the streets on Tuesday. Some may have ventured out to see what life would be like under the new Taliban. Others perhaps simply out of necessity. But most on the streets were male. The few women who were there seemed relieved that the conflict was over. I want to give this message to the youth, that many people were martyred. My son was one of them. I don't want any more bloodshed. One of my sons was in the police and he was killed 2 years ago. The other is still alive. The Taliban might be trying to tap into that desire for peace. One top-ranking official appeared on TV declaring a general amnesty for former government workers. He also called on women to join the government, albeit according to Sharia law. But many Afghans will be extremely wary of the promises made by the Taliban.
Well, let's go straight to Kabul, where we join journalist France Marty. Welcome, France. The Taliban has held a press conference. We'll see images in just a moment. What have they been saying?
The press conference just started minutes before your program. So when the spokesman, the main Taliban spokesman started, he said, rather reiterated like general things, that they have liberated the nation from occupation, that it is the Afghans' right to themselves determine what system they want, but that there has to be like Islamic system in the view of the Taliban. He assured people that security will be provided. But these were kind of only the opening remarks, and then I joined your program, so I can't say what else he said.
OK. And what should we make of this call from the Taliban for government workers to return and for women to take part in power?
To some extent, it is practical. For example, for the government, for running the government, the Taliban arguably need like civil servants who are experienced, because their fighter would be like not trained, not be able to run like civil administration. So to some extent, it is practical. To some extent, it is also because they want to like rebrand them as the new Taliban that are like with whom the international community can engage. So it remains to be seen, because so far the Taliban have said little of how they envision exactly their system. They've only made vague references. Also in the opening remarks to today's press conference, there might be questions at the end of the press conference that they give a little bit more clarity. But in the end, we probably have to wait and see how the system will unfold.
We saw some very distressing pictures from Kabul International Airport yesterday. What is the latest from there now that evacuation flights have resumed?
The situation is apparently still pretty tense. There have been evacuation flights that left like Kabul airport. The situation has a little bit normalized, but I was told that there's still hundreds, if not thousands, people like wanting to go to the airport. I have seen colleagues myself, Afghan friends, who seem to be in a state of panic. given reports that there might be revenge killings, especially like Afghans who have worked with foreigners, more or less like panicking and thinking we have to go to the airport and get out. Some did so, some thought the better of it, because there's like no way that you can just go to the airport and your problems will be solved.
Right. And tell us about the reaction that there has been to yesterday's speech by US President Biden. He doubled down on his decision to withdraw US troops, especially when he asked why US soldiers should fight for Afghanistan when Afghans wouldn't.
Honestly, I mean, there's so many news now, so many changes in Afghanistan. I haven't heard many reactions to Biden's speech that the American left. This was already clear before Biden's speech. So no one really expected that this would be a vast change. And I mean, today, Taliban on the streets, the announcement that you mentioned, that they give amnesty, and then just a few hours ago, the former Vice President, Amrullah Saleh, declared himself caretaker president, claiming that according to the constitution, if the president leaves, the first vice president takes over. So the situation is so fluid.
Right.
Reactions to the speech of the president were limited, at least what I have heard.
Thank you for that, journalist Franz Marti in Kabul. Well, NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has echoed President Biden's sentiments and admitted the alliance was surprised by the speed of the Taliban's victory.
Parts of the Afghan security forces fought bravely, but they were unable to secure the country, because ultimately the Afghan political leadership failed to stand up to the Taliban and to achieve the peaceful solution that Afghans desperately wanted.
Well, let's look at what's going on there with Justin Logan. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and an expert on American foreign policy. His current research focuses on the shifting balance of power in Asia. Welcome to DW. So we've had the US president and we've had the NATO Secretary-General essentially blaming the Afghans for this defeat. So is that them trying to wash their hands of responsibility for the disastrous way this situation has unfolded?
Well, perhaps partly, although I think Biden did say that they were surprised by the speed with which the takeover happened. And I think that implicates the withdrawal of people who helped the United States. I think they thought they had a longer time frame to get people out and were surprised, and now they're kind of scrambling to cover that up. But I do think that, there is something to be said with regard to, there were a number of provincial governors that simply handed the keys to the government over to the Taliban. And if you want to be charitable, what you don't want is a Syria scenario in which there's a brutal civil war, and then the inevitable winds up happening anyway. And in Syria, of course, Assad is still in power. And if the Taliban were bound to take over, what's the purpose of having a brutal civil war between now and then?
I'm interested in how this affects America's image abroad, as it were, because we have a US president who's made good on his promise to withdraw from America's longest war. So how damaging is what happened next for the US and indeed for NATO?
I think that much of what we've heard from the sort of commentariat on this is exactly wrong. There's a lot of political science research on sort of credibility and how different states evaluate credibility. And the way people in Washington, or where I am, talk about this, it tends to be that if we withdraw from Afghanistan, for example, even though this is something we've said we were going to do, it's somehow a betrayal that calls into question American credibility in other contexts. I mean, we've heard people saying in the New York Times today that, Taiwan should be worried, Japan should be worried, NATO allies should be worried about the strength of America's commitment. And credibility just doesn't travel that way. America's interests in Taiwan or Japan or the European continent are the same as they were 6 weeks ago, 6 months ago, or however long ago. So I think there's a tendency whenever we leave a country or abrogate a commitment, even if it's something that we've said we were going to do do, and we're making good on a promise, that's going to implicate commitments elsewhere. And history and all the political science literature suggests that that's not the way the world works.
I suppose that the suggestion is not so much that the withdrawal happened, but the manner of it happening. President Biden deciding to bring that date forward, and then NATO falling in line behind him. If you don't think it damages the United States, does it damage NATO? Because what the United States seems to click its finger, and NATO goes, yeah, all right then.
Right. I mean, that's a cynical view to which I am partial, and I largely agree with. I think you can separate the credibility question from the competence question. And I think if you view the United States as being supremely competent in the execution of the types of wars that we found ourselves in Afghanistan, then yes, that certainly puts lie to that notion. Most people, myself included, thought that we're not at all competent at this sort of thing, and that our expectations should in fact be quite low, and thought this a decade or more ago. So I do think that if you thought that the United States or NATO were very competent at this sort of operation, then yes, that calls that into question. But for most people, I think it was clear a long time ago that we were really flying blind in this.
OK, thank you for that. Justin Logan from the Cato Institute.
Thank you.
Well, the Taliban have been fighting to regain power in Afghanistan since they were deposed by NATO forces in 2001. Our next report takes a closer look at their history in Afghanistan.
The Taliban, or students in the Pashto language, are back in power. But the Islamist militant movement has been a constant presence in Afghanistan for close to 3 decades. The Taliban emerged in the early 1990s. They preached a hardline form of Sunni Islam in border areas of both Afghanistan and neighbouring Pakistan, and promised to enforce their own strict version of Sharia law when they came to power. It was in Afghanistan where the Taliban's influence spread quickly. By 1996, they'd captured the capital Kabul and overthrown the then president. Only a small part of the country remained outside their control, and the vast majority of the international community did not recognise them as a legitimate government. The Taliban's brutal regime included severe punishments such as public executions and amputations. Women's rights were restricted. They had to wear burqas in public and were not allowed to pursue an education past the age of 10. Music, television and movies were also banned. In 2001, the Taliban were accused of providing a sanctuary for those suspected of being behind the September 11th attacks, Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda terror group. Several weeks later, a US-led coalition launched an offensive that resulted in the collapse of the Taliban regime. In the years that followed, the Islamist militant movement's influence spread again. Large parts of Afghanistan were marred by violence. Since 2016, religious cleric Hibatullah Akhundzada has led the Taliban. He's part of the extremist Islamist movement's founding generation. He heads at least 60,000 fighters, with the younger generation being mostly born in Afghanistan and described as more nationalistic. Another key player is the Taliban co-founder Abdul Ghani Baradar. In 2020, and after years of talks, a peace deal was struck between the US and the Taliban. But questions were raised over the Islamist movement's intentions as they continued to carry out attacks, particularly targeting public figures such as judges and journalists. Afghan officials had warned that the withdrawal of international troops would result in the Taliban quickly returning to power. Afghanistan's future, for now at least, appears unpredictable.
Let's try and predict. We can speculate about what this new Taliban looks like. Shamil Shams is from DW's Asia Service. Welcome, Shamil. The Taliban appears to be presenting a new, more humane face. Should we take their promises about an amnesty and women in government at face value?
I believe we should not. We should take it with a grain of salt, because what they are doing at the moment is they are buying time. They are primarily a militant movement, a militant organization, and they are driven by very strict Sharia law, the Wahhabi Islam that we see in Saudi Arabia. So that is not going to change. What has happened over the years, and the Taliban have learned over the past 2 decades, is they have learned to act maturely politically. So it's a political phase that we see now, but I think that the new Taliban is just a facade, and their new regime, their new reign will not be very different from what we saw in 1996, between 1996 and 2001, and when the US invaded Afghanistan.
So why the political sensitivities now? Why do you think they care about what the world thinks now when they didn't 20 years ago?
Because I think the world has changed, and the view about the Taliban has changed as well over the past 2 decades. And the Afghan society has also changed a lot. It's not the same Kabul that they ruled in 1996. It's a different Kabul. Whether we like the US invasion or not, but the US invasion as a result of it has transformed Afghanistan a lot, especially big cities. Now we have more entrepreneurs there. We have more women running businesses. They are in bigger positions. They are politicians. And so Afghanistan has changed, and Taliban realize as a political entity as well, not just as a militant group, that they need to change as well. But the problem is that the ideology remains the same. The problem is not just the Taliban. Any group with this kind of an ideology poses a threat to the civilized world. And the international community should not just buy these claims that, oh, the Taliban have completely transformed and they will be protecting human rights and women's rights. There is as much space for women's rights and strict Sharia law as it could be. There is not much room for human rights in this kind of law.
I'm struggling to understand what makes you think that the Taliban has changed, because even if they haven't, you're saying that they haven't really changed, but they're trying to present a more acceptable face to the outside world and to Afghanistan. Why do they need to do that? The outside world has demonstrated that it is content at this stage to leave Afghanistan to its fate. And Afghanistan's political and military have demonstrated that they are prepared to stand aside and let the Taliban get on with it. So who or what do the Taliban fear that you feel that they need to change the face that they show to the world?
It is a very different thing when you are in opposition. When the Taliban were, let's say, in the opposition and they were attacking NATO troops, the militant attacks that they were carrying out against civilians and the foreign forces, it's a very different thing when you form a government, you run the country. To run the country, it's not that easy that the Taliban have taken over. Now they control everything. They do not control everything. Afghanistan is a diverse society, and also that to run the country, they need the military aid, the financial aid, economic aid that the US has been supplying to Afghanistan for 2 decades. They still depend on that kind of money. So they know that in order to run the government, they need to depend on international forces, also on Pakistan. And Pakistan is also not the same country as it was in the 1990s. There is a different civil society. There are more demand for human rights, and there is more opposition to Islamists in Pakistan than before. So things have changed over the decades, and Taliban realized that. And I think they still will be the same, but they would present a political face to the international community.
Understood. Thank you so much. Shamil Shams at DW Asia.
Thanks.
Well, the German government's evacuation efforts have now begun in earnest, with about 120 people flown out of Kabul on Tuesday afternoon. That followed harsh criticism for delays and an initial flight that carried only 7 people. The German military dispatched transport planes on Monday with supplies and troops. The Foreign Ministry says the latest flight back to the country includes German and Afghan citizens, as well as people from other countries. Omid Nouripour is a member of Germany's Bundestag and speaks on foreign policy for the country's Green Party. Welcome to DW. Can we start with the German rescue mission? Why did the first German aircraft carry only 7 people out of Afghanistan yesterday?
Because of lack of management and organization, and they didn't have proper lists, and they did not adapt to the chaos in the situation we are seeing now in the Kabul airport. And this is This is a pity that they just took 7 people with them, because we know that it's a question of hours until the airport maybe could be closed completely by the Taliban, and this is why we are criticizing this kind of management of my government.
And you blame the bad management on the government in Berlin rather than what was going on the ground in Afghanistan.
We discussed the discussion how to evacuate the locals, those people who are now endangered because they were our support. The first time in the German Bundestag in 2012. And for the last 9 years, our government always told us that there are, of course, plans for this day. And of course, they are well prepared, and they are not. There are thousands of locals who are stranded now, who are not getting any help, who are not brought out. And of course, this kind of message that 7 people have been rescued is much. And by the way, 6 of them has been German citizens, and 1 of them has been a local. Is a very, very bad message for these people, and a signal of and a sign of bad management of my government.
Because even though it improved and a couple of hundred got out on the next plane, as you say, time is of the essence. And yesterday we were talking about thousands of German consulate staff and Afghan assistants and their families needing to be flown out. And yet we're here 24 hours onto day 2 of Taliban rule, and Germany only has a couple of hundred out of there.
All of the report that the situation could escalate massively since June, July has been ignored by my government. They did not adopt it to the situation, and they just tried to find a hideout, not to bring even more people out. And they had a lot of time for the last weeks and months to bring all of these people, to evacuate them and to get them out of danger. They didn't, and we're going to have massive inquiry discussions in the German Bundestag and the parliament to find out what happened there. This is a huge failure of my government when it comes to the moral duty of my country and also of organization. And by the way, it's also bad for the reputation of Germany all across the globe when it shows that you rely on Germans, you won't get support when you need it.